Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton Line is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org. This episode of Acton Line was recorded at Acton University, our flagship conference. Acton University is a 4-day exploration of theology, philosophy, entrepreneurship, international development, and market-based economics. Each day is filled with thought-provoking presentations on the intellectual and practical foundations of a free society. At Acton University, you can sharpen your intellect, expand your worldview, and learn the foundations of genuine human flourishing. To learn more, visit university.acton.org.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, librarian and research associate at the Acton Institute. Today I'm joined by Brad Birzer. Brad is Russell Amos Kirk Chair in American Studies and Professor of History at Hillsdale College. He has been involved with the Acton Institute as a student and then as an instructor since the very early 90s. Today we'll be talking about Russell Kirk. Brad has written sort of the definitive biography on this, and particularly Kirk in the context of sort of the conservative movement and how he fits in there and how he sometimes doesn't fit in there. Brad, welcome to Acton Line, and thanks, you for being with us.
It's always good to see you.
Yeah.
We've known each other a long time, and that's
true.
good. It's all been a blessing.
It's great, and it's great to have you back.
Thank you.
I am actually preparing a seminar right now, and I was asked to put together readings on the American founding, the American conservative movement, and sort of like the political situation in American conservatism today.
Sure.
And when I talked to, the participants are going to have, limited availability in terms of their time to do readings, and the three selections I made for the American conservative movement section were from Russell Kirk, Friedrich Hayek, and from an essay you did for the American Conservative years back called The Seven Conservative
Minds, sure.
Which kind of gets at this really interesting puzzle with Kirk and his relation to the conservative movement, and kind of like gets to his thinking about what this was. And I think maybe that's the best place to begin this conversation is with the conservative mind and how it reflected Kirk's thinking and then continue to develop and reflect his thinking in really interesting ways.
Yeah, that's great, Dan. And I want to give credit to Dan McCarthy as well, who was the editor at the American Conservative at the time that article came out. And he and I really bounced a lot of ideas around. And so I know that I get credit for being the author on that piece. But Dan was essential in making that work as well and kind of figuring out how I would hone the piece, how I would think about Kirk. So kudos to Dan for that as well.
Yeah.
But I had a great time with that. And, it's fascinating, Dan, not Dan McCarthy. But it's fascinating if you go back and look at the early 1950s. So in 1952, you get Eric Voegelin's New Science of Politics, plus you get Whittaker Chambers' Witness. And then the following year, 1953, an incredible year, you get Daniel Boorstin on American Politics, Leo Strauss, Natural Right and History, Robert Nisbet, The Quest for Community, and Kirk, The Conservative Mind, and Bradbury, Fahrenheit 451. So it's really, I think, for conservatism, 1953, but especially if you can bleed a little bit back into 1952, this is really an annus mirabilis, right? This is a great year of miracle. And so that's really where the whole conservative mind, and I don't mean that just in the terms of Kirk's book, but that's where I think the idea of conservatism really came, it flourished in America and would really take hold. And I think that if we look at its history, its trajectory, we can say that conservatism becomes a really deep concern culturally, educationally, and politically from about 1952 up until really about 1989. And then I think once you get George H.W. Bush in office, in office, I think things start falling apart. And also with the fall of the Berlin Wall, a lot of things fall apart for conservatism.
Yeah. So when Kirk is laying this groundwork, and then these other thinkers are laying groundworks in different ways,
Right.
Kirk does it in a very sort of original way.
Yes.
It's not a philosophical treatise. It's not like a rigorous work of social science. It's kind of like it's a more literary approach.
Yeah, definitely coming out of the humanities.
Yeah. Could you, or for listeners who might not have ever read Russell Kirk's Conservative Mind,
Sure.
What kind of book is it? It's a fun book.
Yes.
But it's a very different sort of book.
Yes, it's a strange book.
Yeah.
I think is the best way to put it. I love it.
Mm-hmm.
I've read it many, many times. I actually read it for the first time my senior year of college, right when the wall was coming down. So I was reading it during the anti-communist revolutions of 1989. And what's interesting about it, Dan, is what Kirk does, and he's a historian. Mm-hmm. He's trained as a historian. And so what he does is he writes 29 mini biographies.
Yeah.
That's what the conservative mind is. And it makes sense because Kirk's conservatism is really the equivalent of what would have been called in the Catholic Church at that time, even though Kirk's not Catholic when he's writing this. In fact, he's a Stoic, he's a pagan when he's writing this. But it really is a form of personalism. That's what Kirk is really doing. He's engaged in what a Catholic would call personalism, but he's doing it from a Stoic perspective. And so he's looking at the dignity of the individual, and he's doing it through these 29 biographies, and that's what comes together in the conservative mind. And I think it's really critical to note Kirk never, and we could disagree with him, but he never saw this as an ideology. He always saw conservatism because it was so rooted in the individual that conservatism is an anti-ideology because it looks at the dignity of each person rather than homogenizing the human person.
So this biographical approach, it has precedents, like in antiquity, I think of Plutarch's Lives.
Plutarch, absolutely.
And when I think modern books, there was a book that I read when I was a young man when it came out. Jacques Barzun's From Dawn to Decadence.
Oh, sure.
Is in a way almost organized as a series of biographies.
Right.
There are a lot of figures in the conservative mind that seem to be folks that we would normally think as opposed to each other. Mm-hmm. That Kirk sees as actually possessing either in a strange way similar virtues, or in fact, or maybe even countervailing sort of virtues. How does that work itself out in the book? Because it's a wide selection of folks, from the sort of Anglo-American tradition, and some of them are unlikely pairs.
Yeah, they are. And you think in particular to have Lincoln and Calhoun both in the book, and yet Kirk thinks very highly of both of them. And I think that's where it's really important to note that conservatism is not an ideology for Kirk. Right? It's not something that everybody believes exactly the same way. They have the same program, the same identity. Kirk is really taken, again, as a Stoic, and then when he converts to Christianity in 1964, he is really taken with the uniqueness of each individual person. And even in the conservative mind, where he lays out the 6 tenets or the 6 canons of conservatism, and I think that terminology is very important, right? These are little statements of dogma. They're not universal. They're statements of dogma, so we can believe A, B, C, D, and E, but we may not be able to find D. D may be missing. Okay. And Kirk's okay with that. There's mystery in life. So he's not an ideologue like Marx, where he's trying to find kind of the perfect question and the perfect answer. And so Kirk's second tenet of conservatism is the idea of a truly radical individualism, an individualism that really sees you and me as distinctive manifestations of God. We are unique faces of God, and every person in history, black, white, male, female, Gentile, Jew, we are all unique embodiments of the divine. And Kirk is really taken with that notion. And so it's perfectly possible that you could have enemies who both are conservative. So you can have a Calhoun who's ridiculous in some ways, but brilliant in other ways. And what Kirk does is he looks at someone like Calhoun and he says, all right, what does he contribute? What's the good of Calhoun? And then he looks at Lincoln and he says, what does he contribute? What is the good of Lincoln? And so we can find greatness in both men, even though, say, from a Straussian perspective, they would explode on impact with one another. Yeah. Kirk's not looking at it that way. He's looking at them as individuals and drawing from them. And I think Kirk, too, even before he's a Christian, recognizes that there's a fallenness to man. But Kirk doesn't dwell on the fallenness of man. He dwells on the excellence of man. And that's his personalism. Again, not a term he would use. Yeah. I'm putting that on him. But also what I would say, and something that Kirk did embrace, was his Christian humanism. And Kirk very openly called himself a Christian humanist in the 1950s.
So there's this openness on the one hand. On the other hand, the conservative mind, he does end up writing certain figures out.
Yes.
What are who are some of those figures? Because the Conservative Mind is a book that expands and contracts with his own thinking and with his own approach. And it expands and contracts, and some people are added, some people are subtracted, some people are subtracted, then added back. Then, there's an ongoing organic evolution to this book that's really, really fascinating. And when you think about Russell Kirk as a personalist and a Christian humanist, this is a complicating question.
Right.
Because especially with the writing out of certain figures. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I think probably the most blatant writing out of a person would be Isabel Patterson, who shows up in the first edition and then is dropped. Kirk had an interesting relationship with her. She was a very famous newspaper woman, and she wrote a very interesting book in which called The God of the Machine, in which she talks about all of this idea that we are personal energy. It's very Epicurean. So we're atoms that come together. We have this dynamism to ourselves, and we live out this life as an individual. And she's kind of cranky, and she's eccentric, and she's good friends sometimes with Rose Wilder Lane and Dorothy Thompson and Ayn Rand, but doesn't always get along with them either. She's a disciple of Albert J. Nock. And so Kirk in World War II corresponds with her, and they have a nice correspondence for a while, and then it falls apart. And I think for someone like Kirk, he could be crotchety. He could be a bit of a curmudgeon, depending on where he viewed someone. But there was always a sense of Kirk that the personal relationship really mattered. And so when he met T.S. Eliot, for example, for the first time in the late summer of 1953, he went from admiring T.S. Eliot to cherishing T.S. Eliot. Whereas for someone like Isabel Patterson, he went from admiring her to having a falling out with her. And so it does make sense from a personal standpoint that Kirk is no longer as interested as promoting Isabel Patterson within the conservative mind. But Albert J. Nock stays. And there are moments where he makes more of an appearance and moments where he makes less of an appearance, but he is in the conservative mind through all 7 editions, really 7.5 editions, but in a variety of different ways. And so he kind of waxes and wanes within Kirk's thought. But, I wrestle with this as well when I was writing the biography of Kirk, which I had a blast doing. It was one of the greatest projects I've ever had the privilege of working on. But I had to figure that out as well, because I wondered, when Kirk is young, he's radically libertarian. When he is older, he's very anti-libertarian. And yet his ideas have not really changed, but his relationship to those people who are libertarians has dramatically changed. And so I think that when we take Kirk into account, we always have to take the relational into account as well. So he's not the objective scholar that some of us would like him to be. He still is the human person who has weaknesses, and in those relationships, he either promotes people or he deflates their vision within his vision over time.
So you mentioned Fahrenheit 451 earlier. And I'm thinking now as you're describing this, Ray Bradbury would talk about writing, and the important thing in writing was to not think and to let your feelings drive you. And that thinking can, in some cases, thinking can lead to overthinking, and it can paralyze the writer, and it can drain the life and vitality out of his prose and out of his own thinking, paradoxically. And I think about that maybe as Kirk is writing and rewriting the conservative mind, he's doing it with passion. Yeah. And it's a very passionate book.
Yes.
And if you're not passionate about folks anymore, I'm not sure if he could even, take that sort of coolly analytical perspective and wind up with the kind of book and the kind of prose and the kind of thinking that he does.
Yes. Almost everything Kirk wrote was, number one, romantic, and number two, it was autobiographical. And it's good that Kirk's an interesting person because he always puts his person into his writing. And you see that always, not just in the conservative mind, but especially in the follow-up to the conservative mind, a program for conservatives. It is so deeply personal in the way that he writes. And again, he's interesting. So the writing's interesting, but handled by a different kind of person. That poetry, or the poetry of the writing, it's prose, but the poetic feel of the writing would have been deadly. And I think that's why many people had a kind of visceral reaction to Kirk. They read him and they didn't like him, and therefore they didn't like his writing because they didn't like him as a person, and they dismissed him as a romantic. Bradbury's a different figure because he and Kirk immediately like each other. They become very close friends, and they remain close friends and allies until Kirk passes away in 1994. And even then, when they're writing the Festschrift for Kirk, Bradbury, even though he's so famous at that point, so much more famous than Kirk is, it doesn't matter. Bradbury still contributes to the Festschrift because he realizes that Kirk was his friend. Bradbury is also, I would never call him a conservative. He's much more of a civic and civil libertarian, probably if we had to narrow it. He's a liberal in the way he votes until the mid-1960s, and then he switches, and he becomes a Nixon voter in the 1960s, and he's disgusted by how warlike the Democrats have become in the 1960s, especially with Vietnam, and he hates Lyndon B. Johnson. But you're absolutely right, Dan. Everything that Bradbury does is about emotion. And again, Bradbury and all of his writing, even his most abstract short stories, are always in some way about Bradbury. And there's an autobiographical element to what he's doing, always a romantic element to what he's doing. And in that sense, Bradbury could have never been an ideologue. Even if he's not a conservative, he never could have been an ideologue because he doesn't think like that. He's not a systematic thinker.
The exact opposite is Friedrich Hayek.
Yes.
Who Kirk has a falling out with. And also his position in the conservative mind, the book shifts as well. How much of that, in your biography, has great research into this sort of question about how this falling out happened and everything. How much of that is a product of Hayek is a very rigorous social scientist.
Yes.
And Kirk is a very literary romantic. Right. How much of it is that more than anything?
Yeah.
Because the question that I ask when I pair readings of Kirk and Hayek is this really that different? As they both very much at different parts of their lives saw themselves as representing very different positions in the
Right.
conservative movement.
Yeah, it's a great question, Dan. And I'll admit my personal bias. I love both men, and I would consider myself a Hayekian as much as I would consider myself a conservative in the Kirkian tradition. So I'm very taken with both men, and I think that they actually did have a lot in common. They both loved Edmund Burke. They both loved Alexis de Tocqueville. They both admired, they didn't love, but they both admired Lord Acton. And if we went back to, say, the American Revolution, they would have both been Whigs, radical Whigs. And so there's a lot that they have in common. But their key difference, and you just nailed this a moment ago, their key difference is that Kirk is a Platonist, and he is deeply in the humanities. And Hayek is an Aristotelian, and he is deeply in the social sciences. And I think it's also really important to note that when Kirk and Hayek are both friends, and they are early on, and then they have their falling out, Hayek is the prominent figure in all of that. He is roughly 20 years older than Kirk. Kirk is a young upstart. And here's Hayek, who's a very established scholar. He's a very established economist. And here's Kirk, who's kind of obnoxious, trying to make his way. He's young. He's 20 years younger, a little bit more than 20 years younger. And he's really challenging the dominance of Hayek. And so you can imagine, just from that perspective, Hayek's going to be a little offended by that. Yeah. And I understand that. And because, again, Kirk is the upstart in all of that. And so Kirk has a great love of Hayek early on, especially after the road to serfdom. And then they have a falling out about 1953, right when the conservative mind comes out. But they maintain at least a kind of cordial relationship until 1957. And then they have that debate at the Mount Pelerin Society. And it's interesting. I would love to have been there. Yeah, I'm still 10 years away from being born at this point. Yeah. So not even a possibility that I would have been there. But what a great moment in the history of the non-left, right? When we think about whatever we want to call ourselves, conservatives or libertarians, I think it was a key moment in the history of the right. I hesitatingly use right, but basically in the non-left. And to see that division where Hayek gives his speech, Why I Am Not a Conservative, which ends up being the epilogue to the Constitution of Liberty. And Kirk spontaneously gets up and challenges Hayek and gives this speech, which from the few references we have to people who were actually at the talk and the debate, they say that Kirk won. Yeah. And Kirk's not a great debater. He's not a great public speaker. Hayek is both of those things. So Kirk must have really been on fire in order to challenge Hayek and maybe to have come out the winner in that.
It's an amazing story. And the other sort of thing that I always think about, I was talking to Stephanie Slade about this. We're at Acton University as we're recording this. And we were talking about sort of differences of these figures. And I brought up how, in reading your biography of Kirk, one of the things that I hadn't realized until I read that biography is sort of how accidentally Kirk stumbles into the arena of partisan politics. Yes. And, he doesn't set out, it's a non-ideological frame. Right. But he quickly gets seized on, particularly in the Goldwater campaign, as a sort of intellectual that Goldwater very much admires and gets put into sort of the political spotlight. Could you describe how Kirk felt about that at the time, and then also like how he looked back on that involvement later in life?
Yeah, it really is from the perspective of Kirk's scholarship, it is one of the central questions. Why does Kirk get involved in politics? Because the conservative mind is so clearly not a political book. It is a book next to politics, but it in and of itself is not political. It's poetic, it's romantic, it's literary, it's couched in the humanities. It has really nothing to do with politics. And the whole movement, if you look at Strauss, if you look at Vogelin, if you look, Bradbury becomes a little political, but if you look at Nisbet, none of the other guys that are involved in the conservative revival get involved in politics at all. But Jaffa does,
Yes.
and Kirk does, and they become intimately involved in politics. And I do think it's accidental. Barry Goldwater, upstart, young, brilliant senator from Arizona, the junior senator, is elected or takes office in 1953, the same year as the conservative mind. And he openly says the two books that shape everything he believes in are, number one, The Road to Serfdom, and number two, The Conservative Mind. Those are the two great touchstones for Barry Goldwater. And so Goldwater goes into the Senate, and he is deeply conservative in what he's doing, radically libertarian in his viewpoints. And he calls up Kirk, literally calls him up on the phone out of the blue and says, I want you to be one of my unofficial advisors. And Kirk is thrilled. And remember, and I think this is very important, Kirk is still in his 30s. Yeah. He's a young man who's gone from total obscurity to huge fame within a few months in 1953. Nobody knew who he was in February of 1953. Everybody knew who he was by August of 1953. And he is reviewed everywhere. There's a great moment. I love this. Yeah. Kirk shows up at a bed and breakfast in the Scottish Highlands. And when he signs his name, Russell Kirk, the person who owned the B&B says, are you the Russell Kirk, the author of The Conservative Mind? And Kirk knew at that moment he had made it. Yeah. Right? If he could be in the Highlands of Scotland at a B&B where the owner recognizes who he was, obviously he's gone from obscurity to fame within just a couple of months. And that's huge for him. He quits his job at Michigan State University, he resigns very openly. He becomes a freelance writer and philosopher, making money basically from his speeches and his debates and from what he's writing in books. And that's stunning. And so all of that plus this young, very good-looking, very charismatic senator says, you're my man. Mm-hmm. And, Kirk he's taken in by that. And I would say at one level, and I don't mean this to be derogatory, but Kirk is seduced by politics. Mm-hmm. And I don't think he ever intended for that to happen. And there's a lot of criticism of him for doing that. So because at that point, once he becomes involved in the Goldwater campaign, and you can see this, the New York Times, prior to Kirk becoming involved in the Goldwater campaign, follows Kirk everywhere. The New York Times is constantly reporting on Kirk. Kirk gave this speech. He's writing this book. He said this thing about this. And the moment Kirk becomes involved in the Goldwater campaign, he doesn't show up in the New York Times again. He does, but it's very, very rare. And prior to that, his conservatism was acceptable to the left. After that, it's not. And I love this, Dan. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to play with this, but Google has what's called an N-gram.
Oh, yeah.
N as in the letter N, and then gram. And you can put a person's name in. And if you look at Kirk's reputation in the N-gram from 1953 to 1964, it skyrockets. Mm-hmm. And then in 1964 with the Goldwater campaign, it drops precipitously. Mm-hmm. And Kirk in the N-gram never attains the popularity he had even over the next 30 years of his life. From 1964 to 1994, he never recovers from that. He's constantly going back up, but it never reaches the level that he was in 1964. And I find that very telling. And I think it's because he's political, he's damaged goods for the left. He's no longer this interesting figure. He's now just another politico after that.
Yeah. I was talking to Stephanie Slade about Frank Meyer, and sort of Frank Meyer came out of the Communist Party. And we were talking about how a lot of when we look at this conservative revival, at this conservative tradition before the Goldwater campaign, a lot of these folks, Robert Nisbet's a sociologist, you have authors, you have literary figures, you have historians, and a lot of that energy gets funneled into political fights, political battles at a certain point. And this conservative revival becomes politicized and becomes sort of a movement among many movements within the Republican Party in the United States.
Right.
I see that as a tragedy in a lot of ways, because these thinkers aren't narrow political thinkers. These are, even the social scientists like Hayek are humanistic thinkers. And they tell us something about ourselves in society that is more enduring than the next election cycle, than the next legislative initiative.
Right.
How do you think about that as somebody who's a scholar of this tradition, and you've dealt with many of these figures, and you've seen this temptation? Some resist, some don't.
Right.
Some of them, their actually reputation is enhanced through political involvement. They don't all have the same story as Kirk in that regard.
Yeah.
How do you see that in this sort of conservative, libertarian, fusionist movement? How does that role of politics? I mean, fusionism, as Meyer defines it, almost becomes like a political coalition, as opposed to like a tradition of humanistic thought.
Yeah. It's an incredible question, Dan, and I'm not sure I can answer it coherently. I'll give it a try here. I'll make a stab at it. I think from a political standpoint, so I'm going to be pro-politics for a moment. If we look at what happens, there is a direct line of continuity from Kirk and the conservative mind to the Goldwater campaign to the Reagan Revolution. And Reagan recognizes that. In 1989, he gives the Presidential Medal of Freedom to Kirk. And I think that basically what we have, and I'm going to speak about this from a kind of Nisbetian, that is Robert Nisbet perspective for a moment. And I had said this at the very beginning of our interview. But for someone like Nisbet, there's a golden age of conservatism. And that conservatism really goes from 1943 with the publication of Albert J. Nock's Memoirs of a Superfluous Man. It goes from that date until 1989. And for Nisbet, it starts floundering about 1981. Kirk would take it a little bit farther, but I think, and so now I'll switch for a moment and say that if we look at the best of conservatism in that time period, 1943 to 1989, it is always cultural and it is literary. And there's a deep understanding there. And you get people like Lukács who come out of this, or even someone who, here in Grand Rapids, who's not as well known but should be, Gleaves Whitney, very important figure, I think, in the early 1990s, especially in what he does with cultural conservatism, what ISI was really doing, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, what it was really doing in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, into the late 90s, actually, even into the early 2000s, the kinds of things they were doing by promoting a real cultural conservatism and looking at figures like Joseph Pieper, T.S. Eliot, or going back to Dante and really thinking about the Western tradition and what Western civilization meant. And the danger of that, Dan, is that since roughly 1989, conservatism, I would say, and here's where I have to be careful, and I'm not sure I'm qualified to speak on this. So I'm really speaking biographically here, that is autobiographically. But I think what really happened after Reagan, two things. One, we became incredibly militarized. Now, that's going to sound strange because we won the Cold War. But I think one of the genius aspects about Reagan is that we built up the military to the nth degree, but we never used it. And that was critical for Reagan. It was critical that we had a 600-ship Navy and all the nuclear missiles we needed and good land forces, but you use it as a means not to go to war. We get to George H.W. Bush, and what do? We get involved in Panama, and then we get involved in the Gulf. And he uses that military to the nth degree. And we've been living with that now. George H.W. Bush's war machine, we've been living with that without a stop to the present day. It waxes and wanes a little bit, but every president has intervened militarily in one way or another. Everyone, even Donald Trump, who's claimed to be a peace president, has been very interventionist overall. And I'm not trying to be political here. Just objectively, we're very militaristic. And I don't think conservatism knows what to do with that. The second thing I would say, Dan, so the first thing is we're militarized. We've become imperial, right? We've become imperial. And the irony of that is that when the Soviets were our adversary, we were not political because we couldn't be. We had a very powerful position militarily. We were very, very strong in our military, but the Soviets were a check to us. Now they're not. Russia's not a check. Not really. Not in the way that it was. And so we're left with America being the lone giant in the world. Now, of course, being challenged by China and Russia to a certain degree, but nothing like what it was during the Cold War. But the second thing, and I don't mean to knock anyone individually here, but the second thing that happened to conservatism was it became radically popular and populist. And so, again, I'm not trying to knock this person in particular. I admire him very much. But I think Rush Limbaugh radically changed conservatism. He made it a talk show. He made it a kind of game show. And he popularized it. But in doing so, he took it from this realm of the Socratic to the realm of the everyday. And there's a good to that. There's a very important good to that. But I think that's where we're at now. We're with a conservatism that's imperial or wrestling with what's imperial. And we're with a conservatism that's deeply populistic. And I don't think conservatives, and I think of lots of good people, my colleagues like Richard Gamble. I think of him. I think of Bruce Fronin. I think of a number of people who are the descendants of Kirk. I'm not sure we know exactly what to do with all of this. And even in the kind of policy think tank world, look at how political ISI has gotten in the last couple of years. Or, and one group that has not is Acton. Acton has maintained its scholarly, objective role in all of this. And I love ISI, don't get me wrong. I'm not knocking it. I think it's just the norm of where things are. We're all wrestling with that. And so here we are, and we're doing this interview in June of 2025. I think conservatism, I won't call it bankrupt because it can't be. Its ideas are timeless. That's what makes it conservative. But I think that conservatism at this point in June of 2025 does not know how to handle the day-to-day issues. Does that make sense?
And it makes sense of the fact that so many folks, both traditionalist conservatives and libertarians, who have traditionally been part of this sort of broader libertarian conservative movement, feel deeply alienated right now, despite the fact that there's a Republican president, there's a Republican Congress, there's a Republican Senate, and most of the Supreme Court has now been appointed by Republican presidents, and yet these people feel displaced. And it's a very strange thing. Sorry, we will cut that out. I just wanted to make sure we have time. It's a very strange thing for those folks because they're part of because there's a whole institutional structure that comes up to support this sort of tradition, this sort of humanistic, personalistic, often religious in character tradition, and it became politicized in a way that maybe if you didn't look too deeply, you could think, oh, maybe this is just the political facet of this thing or the political outworking of this thing.
That's right, Dan.
But now it seems just sort of deeply at odds, and not in all, but in some very fundamental ways.
Yeah.
How do you cope with that as someone who's a historian of this, who treasures this movement?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, for me, I think one of the things, and I felt this as kind of a calling or a mission, I am deeply interested in fusionism, no question about that. And me personally, I'm totally fine with being called a Kirkian conservative or a libertarian.
Yeah.
Both of those terms are fine for me. I don't balk at those at all. I'm a little uncomfortable with classical liberal only because I grew up in a household where all liberalism was kind of the enemy. So that's still not a great word in my mind. And my mother, who's going to be 89 in a few months, I can hear her telling me, Bradley, we're not going to go with that liberal stuff.
Yeah.
But here's what I think about Dan. And so I love Kirk. And I feel this calling to write about Kirk, to write about Hayek, to write about Nisbet, to preserve so much of what they've done. And I've tried very hard with my friend Winston Elliott at something like the Imaginative Conservative. We've tried very hard to keep that vision alive despite whatever is going on in the current day. But think about everything that we're fighting against. And so Kirk dies in April of 1994. And he's young. He's only 74 when he passes away. Right? He's just right on the edge of 75 when he dies. And that's too young.
Yeah.
Right? That's just too young. It would have been great to have had him for another 10 or 20 years.
And it was fairly sudden. He was very active
he was.
the end
That's
of
right.
his life.
The last year of his life was bad. And he went down pretty quickly. But he gave that great speech in 93 at the Acton Institute, right? Kind of controversial because he was questioning Acton himself, but still a great speech. And then he goes downhill very quickly, loses so much weight, but has a beautiful death, a very profound death where he's surrounded by his daughters and his wife. And they're singing to him and they're saying hymns. A beautiful death, really. But I'm actually glad he died when he did. And let me explain why. Of course, I miss him. I never knew him personally, but I would have loved to have known him. I don't mean to say it's good he died. I mean to say we're all going to die. I'm very glad he didn't see the gay movement in the way that it came about afterwards. I'm very glad, and I'm not saying that as an anti-gay statement. I just mean I think that would have been shocking to him to see how open everything became with the LGBTQ movement. I'm very glad he didn't see Pornhub. And I'm very glad that he didn't see social media. I think those are things, and I have a number of gay friends. I'm not trying to bash that, but it's a hard thing to reconcile all of those cultural changes with a kind of traditional conservatism that loves Plato, loves Socrates, loves Cicero, loves St. Augustine, right? There's a moment there, and I think, and I feel this in the classroom every day, and I feel this in my own writing. I Brad, as either a conservative or libertarian, it is until my last breath, it's my job to be a teacher, to be a father, to be a writer, and in all of those things, I believe that my goal, and I fail, but my goal is to bring the dignity out of every person I encounter, whether it's my best friend or it's my student or it's my son or daughter. I just feel like that's what we're called to do. And that, to me, is what the essence of conservatism is. And that's a very Kirkian view. It's a very Hayekian view as well. But it's this idea that we recognize the dignity, we recognize the Christ in each individual. We have to. Even in our enemies, we have to do that. And so that's something that I think we have to strive for. And so Kirk, towards the end of his life, if you would ask him, what can I do to change the world? Kirk would say something that sounds like a refrigerator magnet or a platitude. He would say, just brighten the corner where you find yourself. And I think we could be cynical and say, okay, I could see that painted on a Precious Moments figurine. But then you think about it, And it's one of the most profound statements ever made. Few of us in the world are actually going to change the entire world, but we can always change ourselves, and we can always change those around us by leavening them, by praising their goodness, by praising their excellences. And that, to me, is where I think we're at in 2025. I think conservatism is about protecting the beauty that we see everywhere around us. And I think right now, and I could be wrong about this, things could change, I think we've got a great Pope.
Mm-hmm.
I think there may be decisions he makes that I'll disagree with, or things he doesn't make decisions about that I wish he would. But when I look at Leo right now and everything I know about him, he is a saintly, beautiful man. A man who spent his life with the poor in Latin America, and a man now who in everything he does, even when he put the White Sox hat on, there's a dignity to what he's doing. And it very much reminds me of Benedict, and it reminds me of John Paul II. And I would guess, and I hope this is true, I say this as a Roman Catholic, but I would guess that even Protestants right now feel a certain pride in Christianity that maybe they didn't a couple of months ago, because there is this great world leader who's bringing forth something. And so I love that. And, not to get political here, Trump, there are things he does I like, things I don't like. He's not what we would call an exemplar of morality. Leo is. And so how amazing right now we have a world leader who is an American. He's from Chicago. He's as down home as it gets, and yet he's the best of us. And that's really cool.
We have another person to look to.
Yeah.
Which is a very personalist way of looking at it.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Brad, thank you so much
Dan,
for telling us about the person of Russell Kirk, about all these great figures, and bringing us back to them. I mean, this is what you did as I first took Western Heritage. My first class, actually, I think it was my first class at Hillsdale College.
Yeah.
Was Western Heritage with you. And this is the sort of way we would talk about people in history in class.
That's great, Dan.
To really, and it was a wonderful experience. And it's something that I've taken with me through the rest of my life, is to try to not devalue and dismiss others, which is really, really easy to do.
It is so easy to do. For all of us.
Especially if you feel alienated, hurt, resentful. It's very easy to do.
Yeah.
But there's richness there that you miss out on if you do that.
And,
and thank you for engaging with so many of these great figures of the tradition and bringing them to our attention.
Absolutely.
So we can develop those sorts of relationships.
It's a privilege. I mean, it's absolutely a privilege. And Dan, it was a privilege having you as a student, and it's a privilege being your friend now, 20 years later. It's great. Just wonderful.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.